name's Rich Ling. I'm retired, but I've worked at different universities around the world and also at the telephone company in Norway. I started in the late 80s, early 90s, when mobile communication was just becoming popular. I'm a sociologist. I studied in the US. I'm originally from the US in Colorado, but then I moved to Norway. And I worked at the Telephone Research Institute and then at a university in Denmark, IT University of Copenhagen. And then after that, I worked at Nanyang Technological Institute in Singapore. And now I'm retired, living in Norway. It all started, I was working at the Research Institute for the telephone company. And as I said, it was just at the time that mobile communication was starting to become popular. And I remember I read a focus group interview about mobile communication. And I was just really struck with the way people talk about how it had changed things in their lives, about how they wanted a fancy telephone, about how it changed the way they could make appointments, about how sort of immoral it was that children had teens had mobile phones, things like that. And it just struck me that it was a very fascinating area to study. And so I started studying that, and along the way I became involved in a project from the European Union, the COST Project 248, with a collection of other researchers from around Europe who were also interested in that. And this was by then getting in the mid and late 90s, we produced a book, On the Move is the book. It was a collection of articles that was one of the first times that people had written scholarly articles about mobile communication. And from there, I got involved in more and more international things, different conferences, wrote a couple of books on my own, became involved in the International Communications Association and helped develop the MobileCom, now it's a division. The early stuff was very, very qualitative work, very focused on small scale studies. People would go out into the field and find out how people were using the device and then write about that. And it was all mostly Northern European, a little bit of British and a little bit of French work, very much Finnish. They were very strong in it. And then as time went by, it became more and more regularized. Theory became stronger. The forms of data changed. A lot of times in the early stuff, it was just observational work. It was ethnographic observational work. It moved over into questionnaires and testing of hypotheses and that kind of thing. And there's been a phase where it's been network analysis, sophisticated network analysis using the call data records from phone companies. And now it's evolved from sort of piecemeal types of studies to more and more theoretized studies. And also now it's blending more and more into sort of computer-related types of analyses. I think some of the early things, just realizing the fact that instead of calling to a place, you were calling to an individual, into an individual. So the individualization of communication, and that changed a whole lot of things about the way people interact. Changed the way we coordinate, the way we send information back and forth, and all those kinds of things. And so the early mobile communication was basically text and talking, and that was person-to-person interaction. And that really changed the way that we coordinate things. And so I developed the concept of micro-coordination associated with that. With time, the time of the 3G revolution, and then 4G and now 5G, that brought the internet into the scene, where that wasn't so much there before. And now the role of interpersonal interaction is still there to a large degree, but also there's getting information, interacting with different platforms, and now with AI, interacting with different AI information sources. So it's gone from very much just person-to-person types of interactions through access to more internet-based information And then now, we're facing a new revolution with the AI revolution. Oh, the micro coordination would be a good example of that. Before mobile phones, before you could talk person to person, you wanted to meet up with somebody, you had to agree on a time and a place. And if either one of those bits of information was off, then the meeting didn't work. But when you had personal access to one another, whenever and wherever and however, you could just call them. Okay, you're at that restaurant. I thought we said that restaurant. Okay, I'll be there in 5 minutes, or I'm late in traffic, or there was all kinds of things like that. Taking that the next step, in the early uses of mobile communication, that was one person to person. But with the development of 3G and 4G and 5G, you were able to do that with groups. You could do that to a certain degree with early SMS. But now in a group chat, everybody can agree, okay, we'll meet up at that restaurant at 5:30, but Sue is going to be late and Rich is going to come a little bit early, and so on. So you can do that in a sort of a small group sort of setting. So that's another big change. Another thing that I'm realizing more and more is the role of how we interact with platforms. Tinder, all the ride sharing or the taxi-based types of interactions. A lot of different types of platforms that mediate interaction between people who don't necessarily know one another, but are sort of searching out some sort of a time-limited, for example, in the case of a taxi driver, some sort of a time-limited interaction. I don't know where the nearest taxi is to me, but if I took out my phone, I would get a map that there's a taxi up on the road or there's another one over there. Also, for example, in Norway, there's a lot of scooters and electrical bikes and things like that are just around. And to find the nearest one, I can just pull out my phone and, so that's a platform that's mediating me and access to some form of transportation. And we didn't have that before. That's completely new. Well, the mobile connection was quite early, and that was really before the 3G forms of interaction. Those books were sort of using the metaphor, or sort of in the paradigm of interpersonal interaction. But with the development of internet and that kind of information via the phone, there's a transition away from just interacting with other people to also finding out information or paying for things or getting a bus ticket, or it's very my last book, Taken for Grandness, shows how mobile communication is just sort of ingrained in society, and it's different. And it's not like it's nice to have a phone, but it's sort of like you can't live day to day if you don't have a phone, because your friends won't know where you are. You can't pay for the bus ticket. You can't pay for the thing in the restaurant and so on. So it's gone from sort of a nice thing to have to being, in many ways, ingrained, structured into society. Well, I think I'm sort of a qualitative kind of guy. So I go around and ask people, I think that method is still viable, and especially for things that are just coming. Because if you don't have the variables, if you don't have the theoretical structure, it's good to just go out and talk to people and find out what they're up to and how they're making sense of the new innovation, whatever it happens to be. Today, that would probably be AI. But along the way, I have done some more quantitative types of mobile questionnaire research where, you develop the variables and you have the structural equation models and those sorts of things. And then I've also participated in sort of heavy-duty social network analysis, where basically you're not talking about individuals, you're talking about hubs and links between people. For example, there was a bombing in Oslo 10, 15 years ago, and we were able to look at the telephone information about who was calling who in the immediate wake of the bombing. And we found out that, for example, we didn't know any of the individuals, but we knew that node called the most called node their most called node first, immediately after the bombing, and then the second most called, and so on. So we weren't really dealing with people in a sense. We were just dealing with nodes and links, which is quite an abstract thing compared to when I'm out in the field. For example, we did work in South Asia when phones were just coming to different places. We did a little bit of work in North Korea with a colleague, and we've done some work in Myanmar when the phones first came there, and just how people made sense of the phone and how it came into their lives. Also a little bit in Africa, in Senegal, and in Cote d'Ivoire. So I think the methods are the same that I would use, but the questions just keep changing slightly. To a certain degree, I worry a little bit about the disappearing into your phone and not being there in face-to-face interactions. I think that there's so much going on in the phone that we sort of get pulled into that, and we forget to be together with the people that we're around. Another issue that I worry a little bit about is the ability of fake news, deep fakes, those kinds of things, to form social movements and political movements that aren't necessarily good. So there are some dark sides to mobile communication. When I say that, though, it also gives us access to our good friends and, very, very direct interactions. Just before I started talking to you, I got a message from my daughter showing with a photo of my grandson, which is, just very, very nice thing. Because that adds a layer of intimacy, or it's just another chance for me to see a photo of him doing fun stuff, which is sort of the web of social interaction that we tie. So on the one hand, I see some scary stuff associated with mobile communication. At the same time, I see some good stuff associated with it. Yeah.